Welcome, everyone. Today is the first day of our 7-part lecture series called Deconstructing Racism, organized by GCC's very own Social Sciences Division, the Associated Students of Glendale Community College, and Student Equity. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight to learn and unlearn as a community. Before we begin, a few announcements. We have interpretation and closed captioning services available tonight for deaf or hard of hearing attendees. You have the option of pinning the interpreters by clicking on the 3 dots on the box where their faces can be found, or you can follow along with our closed captioning. A transcript will be saved and published after the event. My name is Kayla Regalado, and I am the outgoing Vice President of Administration for the Associate Students of Glendale Community College. And I just want to welcome our presenters today, Michael Dulay, Professor of Psychology and Social Sciences Division Chair, and Richard Kamei, Professor of Sociology, Assistant Social Sciences Division Chair, and Sociology Department Chair. So whenever you all are ready, feel free to go ahead.
Well, I want to start by thanking Kayla for all of her help and support, and Associated Students, as well as our Student Equity Office. They've been terrific and very supportive during this difficult time. This is the first in a series of virtual lectures about racism in the United States. We fully understand that there is a need for much more, for so much more, but we wanted to get something together as quickly as possible so that we could help our community have an informed conversation about the many things that are happening around the country and around the world, and that have been, frankly, happening for too long. A couple of housekeeping items related to tonight's presentation and to the rest of the series. In each of the lectures, sensitive topics will certainly be raised, and we just wanted to caution folks that that's just going to be part of the lecture. There is absolutely no intent to offend. If some of it, if it feels like it's a bit too much, we have scheduled healing circles for Glendale College students. They have information about that. And there will also be a healing circle arranged for faculty and staff of the college. If you do have questions during the session, you just need to go into the chat room and send questions using the account questions with a question mark. You type in your question there. It will be delivered to one of our moderators. Tonight it's Professor Sandy Somo, and Sandy will be pooling the questions. We will get them and we'll be able to answer them during the Q&A at the end of the lecture. We'll also pool the questions and then address them next Friday when the lecture series is wrapping up. Okay? And again, that's this series wrapping up. Our hope is that the college will continue to engage with more of these kinds of topics. And of course, lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we urge you to keep an open mind. Talking about difficult issues such as racism requires that we do put ourselves in places where we're not so comfortable. Fortunately, the first part of the lecture in particular is going to focus, I'm a psychologist, so it's going to focus on the mind and its workings, and maybe we'll give you a bit better understanding of why an open mind is so important. As I often like to tell my students, as you know, part of the experience of being in education isn't simply a matter of packing in as much information as you can. In my mind, the mind works best when we see it as a parachute, in that it doesn't matter how well you stuff it, it just has to open at the right time. And so I encourage you to keep an open mind this evening and through the rest of the week. All right, so let's start. Okay, the goal for tonight is to look at bias, the conscious and unconscious manifestations of it. We'll get to some core definitions. I'll talk about the way the mind works. We'll look at some studies in psychology that have demonstrated the role of unconscious processing in the persistence of bias and in discriminatory practices. And then we will transition to looking at the way the mind develops and the way it uses information and memory to create these structures. And at that point, we'll transition and Professor Kamei will take over, and he will look at this from a sociological lens, which essentially what will happen tonight if we do it right is that the content will seem bigger and bigger and bigger, so that by the time we're done, you have a broad lens to be able to move through the rest of the series. So let's start with an analogy here. I want you to think of a cement plant. and the dust that must certainly accumulate at a cement plant, right? If a worker works at a cement plant, they breathe in the dust from that cement generation after generation. And in fact, they begin to, as you see in the slide here, lose sight of it. They slowly and steadily tolerate that cement. And my cement here is the analogy of bias. But we slowly and steadily tolerate bias at all levels. Over time, we just can't see it anymore, right? One incident, like a surge, a bag explodes and there's a lot of bias, a lot of dust. It makes us uncomfortable, but then it dissipates over time. And we forget, and we go back to our labored existence with the air ever thickening, right? These last 3 weeks have kicked up so much dust in the United States that even the most privileged among the country see it. The dust of racism is suffocating, and frankly, we cannot breathe. Let's look at this dust and how it penetrates who we are, this bias, and how it colors everything we do and everything we see, right? So let's begin here with some concepts, some base definitions for what we're going to talk about today. As Kayla said during the introduction, I'm a psychologist in addition to being division chair. So my lens, the lens I'll be using today is of psychology, right? And psychology is the scientific study of human behavior and mental processes. Sociology is the scientific study of society, including social relationships, interactions, and culture. So those are the two lenses, the two academic approaches that are going to be used tonight. Another word we'll hear a lot this afternoon or this evening is race. And race is a social construction that leads to systemic inequality based on real or perceived physical differences. It's described externally and it's used to reproduce power. There's a lot in that definition, but I want to make sure that a couple of things are clear, right? We are not talking about biological race here. We're talking about what happens when folks perceive physical differences and then they use those perceptions to create inequities, right? And they wedge, right, gaps in between people and between classes, and those wedges persist and worsen over time, right? The closest thing that many folks around the world, not just in the United States, may have to understanding what that is like right now, and just to give you a relevant example, is to think about mask use for a moment. Particularly mask use among men who have difficulty accepting the fact that they're not invincible. Maybe you've heard of the concept of toxic masculinity, right? When you put a mask on, you're identifying that you're being cautious or weak or responsible, right? You can think about what that means to you, right? I wear a mask when I go out because I care about all the people around me. I don't want anybody to get sick. But what happens, of course, when other people see folks in a mask, they assume things about them, right? And it's that snappy judgment that in this COVID, these last few months, I think we realize how powerful that is when somebody gets to look at you and judge you and make decisions about you. Okay? So again, in no way does it amount to the significance of race in the history of the United States, but it is a way to get a sense of what happens when outside forces are able to label you. Okay, race is different than ethnicity. Ethnicity reflects membership in a group with shared experiences, kinship, or culture. And ethnicity is described internally, meaning that I get to select my ethnic group. So, right, if I decide that I am an American or if I am a Filipino American, that's up to me. I pick those things. It doesn't matter, unfortunately, what the folks around me see, right? I don't know if my face is on the screen in this Zoom room. It may just be the slideshow, but oftentimes my students have difficulty pinpointing exactly what it is they think I am. And we often talk about racial ambiguity, right? And so depending on where I am and who I'm with, I shift, okay? But my ethnic choice is consistent, or has been consistent, at least for the last, 28 years or so of my adult life. Two more concepts that we're going to be using tonight. Bias, and bias is a strong inclination of the mind or a preconceived opinion about something or someone, right? So you may have a bias in favor of the Los Angeles Lakers, for example, right? Let's pick an Angelino kind of example. That's real, right? And we lean in that direction when we're walking down a store and we see purple and gold on one side and red on blue on the other. We may just drift, right? We're biased in favor of things that are Lakers. Okay. Another concept, the last one for this slide, is racism, right? Racism is a belief that a particular race is superior or inferior to another race, to another, and that traits are predetermined by inborn biological characteristics, right? That's the dirty reality that we have to work tirelessly to unravel. So when we think about racism, we often, if you were to ask somebody, are you a racist? Most folks will quickly say what? They say no, right? No one wants to acknowledge that possibility. And so in psychology, we've started to look into the concept of aversive racism, right? So aversive is when somebody doesn't like something, when it's painful, when it doesn't feel good. And of course, we see what the definition of racism is. So aversive racism is racism that people may carry but don't want to acknowledge exists. And so one way to look at aversive racism is to go back to the 1950s and to the work of a psychologist, Gordon Allport, right? And what I would like to put on the screen here is a prejudice scale, or he referred to it sometimes as a prejudice ladder. And he wanted to rank the instances that you might see people behaving in a prejudiced way against another group. And so the most simple kind of prejudice that we see is what he calls anti-locution, right? That's literally means speaking against. So verbal insults when you use an offensive term, jokes about another group, right? Stereotypes when you mock perhaps another group's accents or behavior, right? Or just when you make gross generalizations about a group. That's what Allport would refer to as anti-locution. Okay. The next layer of prejudice is avoidance. Avoidance can be individual, right? That's a person walking on the other side of the sidewalk, right? That's choosing to not congregate with a certain group or eat at a certain restaurant, listen to certain music, right? Or it could be institutional, where you start to see institutions move away from other groups. This could also reflect when you see communities moving away from a group. In Los Angeles, if you look at some of the urban sprawl, that's the expansion of the city. We've seen trends that are sometimes characterized as white flight. And that's when you get folks who lived in, for example, the San Fernando Valley, and you see the urban part of Los Angeles move out into the San Fernando Valley, and you saw communities continue to move further west, right? From Ventura, right, to Calabasas, to Agoura Hills, to, right, and you can see that trend, right? It's just going to push out. It's going to push into places like Santa Clarita, Valencia, right? There's just going to be a crawl away from another group. So avoidance, again, is a kind of prejudice in Allport's eyes. It's a lower level form, but nevertheless, it still is one. The third level on his prejudice ladder is discrimination. Discrimination is denial or access to opportunities or services. And this is the one where nobody disputes that this is prejudice, right? Institutional racism is in fact legalized prejudice. So when we enact policies, right, the one perhaps that jumps immediately to mind, things like segregation of schools, right? Anti-miscegenation laws, that one's maybe less common, but anti-miscegenation meant that it was illegal to marry across groups, and it was applied almost exclusively to groups when a person of color was attempting to marry somebody who was white in the United States history. So those are acts of discrimination that are legalized forms of prejudice.
Testing.
The next step beyond this is physical attack, right? And this could be an attack on an individual or on property. So here, this would be the case of hate crimes, where you see vandalism, and as I hope everybody in this session understands, that has steadily increased over the last few years, steadily and dramatically increased over the last few years. And then of course, the highest form of prejudice for Allport, and again, who did his work in the 1950s, right? This is just after World War II. And he points immediately to genocide as being the highest form, the worst kind of prejudice that you see in occurrence. Okay? Many argue that the historical experience of blacks in the United States is a form of genocide. So Professor Kamei is going to dig more into that, and of course tomorrow there'll be even more discussion about that. So let's walk this back though, right? Because as I said, right, most folks say, I'm not racist, right? They don't like the idea of being a racist. So let's peel this back and look at the way the mind works with a simple question there, right? Do you see color? You know, obviously there's color on the screen here, but do we see color in people? And does color matter, right? Now, I'm going to say something to you that I say to all my classes. I firmly believe that learning is a contact sport. So this is the point in the presentation where I'm going to ask questions. I hope that you're in a space where you can say things out loud. As the lecture goes on, I'm going to ask you to take out a pencil and paper and write a few things down for me. And I hope that I sincerely hope that you engage in these activities because they will help. So if you need a moment, I'll wait about 10 seconds, maybe grab a pencil and paper. Okay, so this first one involves no writing. It just involves our good old minds, right? So we're going to do something that was developed in the 1920s and into the 1930s. It's developed by a man named J. Ridley Stroop. It's called the Stroop test. So I'm going to show you 3 different slides. Okay? On the first slide, I'd like you to read the words aloud as quickly as you can. And we're going to go from the top left of your screen down the first column and then down the second column, right? And then on the second slide that follows, I want you to name the colors as quickly as you can. Again, beginning on the top left and going down. And then on the third slide that follows, I'd like you to name the color of ink used to print each word as quickly as you can. Again, beginning on the top left of the screen. So let's start with the first one. I'll read them with you to begin. So we're going to read the color names. Red, blue, green, yellow, blue, yellow, red, green, green, red, yellow, blue, yellow, green, blue, red. I should be seeing everybody's mouths moving on the cameras. All right, so the next slide, let's do this again. But remember, on the next slide, we're going to name the colors beginning on the top left and going down as quickly as we can. Red, yellow, green, red, yellow, blue, green, red, yellow, blue, yellow, green, red, yellow, green, red, blue. Awesome, okay? Now on this next slide, we're just going to name the color of ink, beginning at the top left as quickly as we can. Anybody doing it? I can't hear you. Hopefully you're laughing at yourselves. What's the fourth one down? What color ink is that? It's green, right? Anyone get tempted to say yellow? What's the color on the bottom right? That ink on the very bottom right? It should be blue. What I hope, if you did this, and if you did it out loud, you may be laughing with yourselves or perhaps with your family. What the Stroop test shows us, what it demonstrates is something called automaticity. That your mind engages in automatic processes, right? And so what is the automatic process that you see on the screen here, right? What's happening is, of course, your mind has been trained to read the English language. So when you see the word at the bottom of the second column, your mind wants to say green, even though you're supposed to say red because that's the color of the ink. It just happens. It happens automatically and out of your control. Interesting aside here, if you grew up and English is your second language, you're less prone to make these errors, right? So again, what the significance that you're seeing here, and as it relates to what we're going to talk about tonight and for the next several presentations, right, is that our mind can, in fact, take a life of its own and behave automatically. sometimes contradicting what we would tell other people. So let's look at this in something more closely related to why you're attending this session tonight, right? Does bias occur automatically? Do you think that you may behave in a biased fashion automatically, just as we saw, right, occur in the Stroop test? So here's a question that we see from a research study published just 4 years ago, actually. Do names impact perceptions of physical size and perceived potential for aggression? Just names, okay? Just names. So what are these names that the researchers use in this study? They use stereotypically black and white names, right? So Jamal, Connor, Darnell, Wyatt, Deshaun, and Garrett. They're going to then ask their research subjects, the folks who volunteered for this research study, to assign a body size also based on a prompt that I'm going to show you in a second. And so they pick a perceived size of the person, right? Now, the research study is fairly simple, right? 249 adults participate in this research study, and they're given a narrative. They're going to read, and I will read it to you, a script that describes what somebody's going to do. And then they're going to pick the size of the person, and then they're going to ask a question about aggression, answer a question about aggression, excuse me. So here's the prompt. Let's use the first name up there, right? Jamal woke up Saturday morning and began his day by brushing his teeth and taking a shower. After eating breakfast, Jamal watched TV for a while and talked on the phone. Then Jamal went to a nearby store and bought some groceries. Once he had gotten home, Jamal received a text message from a friend inviting him to go out later. That night, Jamal went out to meet his friends at a bar. As he entered the crowded bar, he brushed against the shoulder of a man walking in the other direction. The man turned, glared at Jamal, and angrily said, "Watch where you're going, asshole." Subject is then asked, how likely is it that Jamal is going to get in a fist fight with the other man in the bar? Again, the only thing that is different here, my friends, is the name. Jamal or Connor, or Darnell, or Wyatt, or Deshaun, or Garrett. And what the researchers at UCLA discover is that people envision men with stereotypically black names as bigger and more violent. Now, please understand that statistically speaking, there is no difference. There's no significant difference between the average height or size between white and black men. That is a stereotype, a very powerful stereotype. Okay, but this is again an example of a recent research that demonstrates how it is, in fact, that our mind runs away from us in the same way that it just did on the Stroop test, but now with a different kind of color, if you will. Let's look at another case, right, where we can ask ourselves this question: does bias occur automatically? Does bias impact the behavior of preschool teachers? So in this research study, conducted just a few years ago at an ECE, an early childhood education conference, actually, they asked teachers who were attending a conference, so they're seeking to better enhance their skills in their profession, to look at a 15-inch screen on a computer laptop. They're going to be shown 12 different 30-second clips, right? Where the clips are either going to, they include black and white children, boys and girls. And they're asked to identify when they thought they were going to see challenging behavior, right? And the computer, while they're doing this, a camera is actually recording the eye movement of the teachers. And here's what they see. Preschool teachers tend to more closely observe black boys than white boys when challenging behaviors are expected, right? You can see, I think, almost immediately, right? It just jumps right out at you. There's an overwhelming lean to look at boys in general, right? So girls are observed far less. Their eyes, when they're tracked, move less in the direction of the young girls in this study, and they go to boys. And here's the thing about what we see, right? Is that no behavioral challenges were actually present in the video. There was no misbehavior in the video. They were just told to expect it. And the eyes drifted in the direction right? Significantly more so toward the black boys in the videos. Let's let that sink in. Let's ask ourselves this question one more time. Does bias occur automatically? So in this case, we want to ask ourselves the question, right? Are children in crime scenes perceived as older and more culpable? Culpable meaning more to blame, right? More culpable based on race. And so what occurs in this research study, again, also, this one's actually also done at UCLA, a different set of researchers. They take a group of university students, and the students are shown photographs of children alongside descriptions of misdemeanors and felonies. They're asked to assess the age and innocence of the black, white, or Latino boys aged 10 to 17. The students overestimated the age of the black children by an average of 4.5 years and found them more culpable than whites or Latinos, particularly when the boys were matched with serious crimes. Now, the evidence, I'm going to read to you here what Professor Jackson says at UCLA, right? The evidence shows that perceptions of the essential nature of children can be affected by race. And for black children, this can mean that they lose protection afforded by assumed childhood innocence well before they become adults, right? This means that somebody who is 13 may be seen and perceived as an adult, right? That is a child. That is a child. Now, so what we're seeing here, right, is again, 3 examples of bias with people that are directly related to race, right? And the 3 slides before that, we looked at the way our mind can behave, in fact, automatically. Let's dig in deeper and look at the way that the brain works in all this, okay? So in our nervous system, there's a structure on the medial portion of our cortex, in the middle of our brains called the amygdala. It's called the amygdala because it appears to have the shape of a nut or an almond, okay? The amygdala is very strongly associated with our fear response. And so we've known this for quite some time, and psychologists, this study I'm going to show you now is from actually 2000, and many of us see it as one of the classic studies. I know it's only 20 years old, but many see it as a classic study that helped us start to question implicit bias, okay? The notion that we could be biased without actually realizing it, okay? So what we see in Phelps' research here in 2000 is that they take research subjects, and the subjects go into an MRI. An MRI is a magnetic resonance imaging chamber. That's the machine. For those of you who don't know, it looks like a donut. It actually generates a magnetic field that could be 4 to 5 times the strength of the Earth. And when it generates this magnetic field, well, sorry, I won't go. I'm just going to sidetrack and start talking about neuroscience. I apologize. So while the subject's inside the MRI, what the MRI allows the researcher to do is see a 3-dimensional image of the brain without actually having to go in and do a dissection. Okay. So while they're in the MRI, the subjects categorized words as good, and the good words, peace, joy, and love, or bad, cancer, death, and war, right? While looking at a face that they would categorize as black or white. During the first half of the trials, during the first half of the trials, good was paired with white and bad was paired with black. So they would have buttons, and then they would just click black. When they would click a good button when they saw the white face, and depending on the word, and they would just click a button. The second half of the trials, the pairs were switched. What do I mean by the pairs were switched? It means that the black face was now paired with the good words. Okay, so in this second half of the trials, a significant number of subjects actually had difficulty with the second task. That is, pairing good with black and bad with white. So when I say difficulty, it means that they were slower and they made more mistakes. So they would see a black face and they would click the bad word, right? So what does this tell us when we're looking inside an MRI? It tells us that the amygdala, was more active, first of all, when they're looking at black faces. Remember, the amygdala is strongly associated with fear, or suppose more current research, when we see stark differences, the amygdala activates so that we can process this new thing in our environment. So again, the amygdala is more active when looking at black faces in some of the cases. And as I just said, slow responses were associated with the need to override the amygdalic response. In other words, we went slower in our processing because we had to override this initial primitive reaction of fear. Now, that's digging into the brain. Let's look at a much more significant and a research study, actually, that when we're done with this session, you can go be a part of if you'd like. This next research that I'd like to look at when we're looking at implicit bias is going to come out of Harvard University. So let's be clear then. Implicit bias is the tendency for stereotype confirming thoughts, to pass spontaneously through our minds, setting people up to overgeneralize and sometimes discriminate, even when they feel they are being fair. So the study that I'm going to show you the results from actually is run through Harvard. If you just go onto Google and you type Google, you don't have to type Google, go to Google or whatever your search engine of choice is, and do a search for Harvard implicit bias. Harvard has a terrific implicit bias test that they've been using to collect data since 2004 publicly. And so what they've discovered with the same kind of task, right, where you look at a face and then you look at words and you have to match the two. The test takes no longer than 7 minutes to do. So I encourage you all very much to go and try this when we're done with the lecture tonight. Here's what they find. 23% of their respondents reported a strong automatic preference for light skin, meaning that they would associate the good and light words quickly. Right? 28% had a moderate automatic preference for light skin. 17% had a slight automatic preference for light skin. You can already see the dominance on that pie chart, right, from this sample. 18% had little to no automatic preference between the skin tones, none at all. My hope is that 18% would reflect an overwhelming majority of this chart, but that's not the case here. Let's get to those smaller slices now. 7% had a slight automatic preference for dark skin. 5% had a moderate automatic preference for dark skin, and only 2% had a strong automatic preference for dark skin. Now, when we do research, we should ask about sample size. And here's what's astonishing about this. Right? These IAT scores, right, from this data actually reflect 864,463 IAT tests. It's almost, right, that is getting close to 1 million now. And as far as research samples are concerned, that's remarkable. And what we know when we're doing power analysis, when we're looking at research, is how much we're comfortable generalizing when we see things like this. Okay, so again, for me, this is highly alarming because it does give some strong scientific support for our mind's tendency to engage in this implicit, automatic, unconscious biasing. So to peel back the layer of implicit bias, I'd like to ask you and ask ourselves, I guess, right? When do we acquire the meaning we give to color? Right? And I obviously race is the subject at hand this evening, but let's really take a look at this, right? When do you have your first memories, my friends? Just think back for a second. The typical human being does not remember what it was like to be 6 months old, or even 18 months for that matter. Our first memories begin sometime in preschool. Did we not exist before that? What happened to all those experiences, right? As we were acquiring information about the world, they went into our minds and into, as we just saw with the amygdala, into our brains. And they started to help us make sense of the world. So let's look at color. On the screen here, we see just some crayons. And when we're children, we learn pretty quickly things like this, right? Like that crayon is orange. Everybody agrees? I hope so. That one's greenish. Blue, might put a question mark there. Red, right? We start to identify colors, and those colors help us make sense when we're trying to decide what color to shade an apple, right? Or a banana. We don't want to color the banana blue, so we look for a yellow crayon. As we get older, we run into words like this: taupe, mauve, chartreuse, salmon. Wait, is that a color or a fish? Anybody? You wonder? This is powerful stuff because memories, these labels, they actually give meaning to our worlds, right? We start to label the world based on the way that we categorize information. So when you're a child and somebody tells you that a ball is a big red shiny thing, right? When my daughter was a little girl, we had a ladybug ball and it was red and shiny. So it was a beautiful ball. And early on when she saw a tomato, she referred to it as a ball. I'll never forget it, right? And do you take the tomato and smack it on the ground because you think it's a ball? It's supposed to bounce, right? That's the meaning I've given to tomato, right, to a ball, excuse me. So, right, as a father, I have to get down next to her and say, honey, that's not a ball. And she looks at me like I'm crazy, as she often does now. And she says, no, ball. And I say, no, it's a tomato. And she looks at me and says, mato? And I say, yeah, it's a tomato. And in order for me to help her understand what that means, I bite into it. And she's like, oh, and it's a tomato, it's a fruit. Right? Usually when I say that, people make faces, right? And then now you're wrestling with how do you define a fruit versus a vegetable, maybe. Anyway, just a few moments later, I take a peek in the living room and I see my daughter trying to bite her ladybug ball, right? What's she doing? She's trying to test what I just told her. I've given her meaning to something, and now she doesn't know if it's real, if it's true. So meaning starts to create structure for us in the way that we categorize the world, right? So now when my daughter sees an apple, which is red, right? She's going to look at it and call it a red, spherical, shiny thing, a tomato. No, it's an apple. And then we just go on through life and you see other colored things, you call them tomatoes and you adjust, right? When you're a child, perhaps you learned what a falafel was, right? And you ate falafels and you enjoyed falafel and you ate falafel, and then you first time maybe going to an Italian restaurant and they had meatballs and you called the meatball a falafel. And somebody had to stop and correct you, right? Because that's not a falafel, right? And they're wildly different, obviously, right? But maybe the shape, I don't know. No, maybe not. Anyhow, what I'm hoping you're seeing here is that, again, the impact of the significance of the way our mind categorizes information. So let's look at this, right? With another hopefully fun example. You have that paper and pencil or pen handy? All right. We're gonna just do a simple task, and we're gonna look at your memory and how absolutely astonishing it is. I'm gonna read you a list of words. We're gonna do a short task, and then you're gonna take a few seconds to write down that list of words. Everybody ready? Everyone have their pens? I have mine. Okay. Here's the first list. Fear, temper, hatred, fury, happy, enrage, emotion, rage, hate, mean, ire, mad, wrath, calm, fight. Now stop and look at the screen for a second. Let's take the number 60 and we're going to subtract 7 from the number 60. Okay, so what's 60 minus 7, everybody? Say it out loud, please. 53. What's 53 minus 7, everybody? 46. What's 46 minus 7? 39. 39 minus 7? 32. 32 minus 7? 25. 25 minus 7 is 18. And 18 minus 7 is, of course, 11. Now, take your pen and on your paper, I would like you to write down as many words as you can recall from the list I just read to you. Not the numbers, but the list I just read to you. Let's take a few seconds and try to write down as many words as you can recall, please. Just take 5 more seconds. Okay, pens down. Let's do this again. See how this works for you now that you know what I'm going to do with the math. You're going to brace yourselves for more math, but that's okay. So here's another list. Ripe, citrus, vegetable, juice, cocktail, banana, orange, basket, bowl, salad, berry, kiwi, pear, apple, cherry. Now for this next list, we're going to multiply by 2, right? This is easy, everybody. Put your pens down. Go for it with me. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. 16 times 2 is 32. 32 times 2 is 64. 64 times 2 is 128. And 128 times 2 is, of course, 256. Now write down that list of words, please. Let's see if we can get that list of words down. Just 5 more seconds. Okay. Pencils down. And I promise this is the last list and the last bit of interaction for at least nope, it's not the last. I have one other short one, but let's put your pens down. Let's do this one more time. I'm going to give you one last list of terms. Steal, robber, jail, villain, bandit, criminal, rob, cop, money, bad, burglar, crook, crime, gun, and bank. Now for this last list of numbers, we're going to add 7, right? This is fun. We're going to add 7. So let's keep it simple. We'll start with 13. What is 13 plus 7? 20. I'm watching our AS Vice President. She's saying the numbers for me. What's 20 plus 7? 27. 27 plus 7 is 34. 34 plus 7 is 41. 41 plus 7 is 48. 48 plus 7 is 55. And 55 plus 7 is 62. Now go ahead and write down that last list of words, please. Last list of words. Okay, 5 more seconds. All right, so on that first list of words, I obviously don't have a way of seeing all of you and walking around the classroom or talking to you and shaking hands, but on the first list of words that I read to you, how many people wrote down the word anger as one of your words? On the second list of words, how many of you wrote down the word fruit? On the second list of words, how many of you wrote down the word fruit? And on the third list of words, how many of you wrote down the word thief? I never said anger, fruit, or thief. I never said any of those words. And before you think I'm lying, this will be recorded, so I guess you can listen to it. But just to be clear, the first list was fear, temper, hatred, fury, happy, and rage, emotion, rage, hate, mean, ire, mad, wrath, calm, fight. Never said anger. The second list of words were ripe, citrus, vegetable, juice, salad, banana, orange, basket, bowl, salad, berry, kiwi, pear, apple, and cherry. I never said fruit. And the last list was steal, robber, jail, villain, bandit, criminal, rob, gun, money, bad, burglar, crook, crime, gun, and bank. I never said thief. What this shows us, of course, is that our minds, our memories are in fact subjective, suggestive, and malleable. Right? It's another example of the way that we create meaning. So on each one of these lists, I gave you a list of words that activated a category in your mind. Then I distracted you with math, and then I asked you to recreate that list. And in an effort to recreate it, many people pick a word that is an exemplar of it, right? They pick a word that represents that category. So anger represents the first category of words, fruit represents that second category of words, and then thief represents that third category, right, or semantic network of words. Okay. Now, moving on here, let's look at this in a quicker task, right? This one's easy, I hope. So we'll just unscramble these words. So the first set of letters on the left column, right, we just unscramble that, it's rose. The second word is stem. The third word is red. The fourth one is petal, stalk, thorn, and leaf, right? If you're just unscrambling letters. Why not flee? Another example of, right, priming, right, of the way that our minds, our memories can in fact take over what we think we're going to see, even when we want to see something else. So the way this plays out then is when we start to interact with other groups and we look at the way they categorize information. So I'll return to this image in a second, but if we looked at these four items on the screen, right, which item is the odd object out? What doesn't belong there? You ask this to most Americans, they do this. They say those three are tools, and that bottom one is not a tool, and therefore it does not belong. And again, our mind does this automatically, categorizes information automatically. So, well, why do we categorize? Why is it so important? And I know there's a book published, I think 8 years ago now, called Thinking Fast and Slow, where a Nobel Prize winning economist actually looks at this and comes up with some interesting claims about thinking fast and slow. So we categorize information because categorization leads to efficiency. If I categorize tools, I can sort my garage much more quickly, right? Efficiency is fed by familiarity. Okay? Familiarity undergirds group formation. Group formation leads to in and out groups. In and out groups support social identity and esteem, meaning that we like to be around people that are in our in group. I mentioned the Los Angeles Lakers earlier. Anyone that's been to, and I know it's been at least 3.5 months since we've been to a sporting event, but you know, when you went to watch the Lady Vax play ball and beat up on all these other teams around the city, you were a vaquero, right? And you were proud to be at Glendale and you were rooting for them. And when you saw the other team, you made a face because they weren't from Glendale. They weren't vaqueros, right? That's an in and out group, my friends. If you go to a Dodger game and they're playing against the San Francisco Giants, in and out group, right? If you like Hamilton and somebody else likes Star Wars, right? And you're a theater buff, your theater, that's an in group, right? The other ones are out groups. They don't like theater, right? So we have these in and out groups, okay? And social groups, of course, are the basis for culture and society. They matter. Now, let's look at the significance of each one of these lines, okay? Categorization leads to efficiency. So do we study and learn what we already know because it's more efficient? Think about this, especially all of you who are students, right? If you're good at math, do you like to take humanities courses? If you like reading and you like writing and language, do you like to take chemistry courses? Or do you just drift down the road that you're familiar? And could that, I'm not saying it does, but could it lead to closing your mind because you don't want to see or hear another perspective? The second line, right? Efficiency is fed by familiarity. Do we surround ourselves with the familiar? Think about your social media feeds. In case you don't know, they are designed to feed you information based on what you already click on or like or follow. So if you follow a bunch of athletes on your Instagram account, right, you're going to see a lot of recommended athletic feeds coming to you. And in a way, it feels good, doesn't it? Because it is exactly what you want and expect. When I was younger, and I'd like to think I'm not that old, you grabbed the newspaper and you opened it up and you couldn't hit sort or find, right, the things I like. You actually went from A1 and you flipped pages looking for things that you wanted to read or study. When we had books, you couldn't do a control find because there weren't digital books. You actually had to read the whole book and write on it and stick Post-its everywhere. And that's how we acquired information. When it comes to us quicker, we like it. It feels good. It comes to us much more quickly. Okay? The third line, familiarity, right, undergirds group formation. So do we surround ourselves with like-minded people, right? And does that lead to groupthink, where we no longer have individual opinions, we just agree with what the group does? Fourth one, group formation leads to in and out groups. Do we engage in in-group favoritism, right? Do we explicitly bias ourselves in favor of our own group? We go into a restaurant, somebody sees that you look like them and you speak the same language, and so you get a table. Does that happen? Do you get a special discount because you're from a certain in-group? Now the fifth line there, in and out groups support social identity and esteem. Do we engage in derogation of the out group? Do we put other groups down in order to make us feel good? Do we talk trash about other schools, about other teams, about other, right, groups of people? These are all important to understand because although categorization is part of what our mind does, we have to always be alert, right? Because, right, think about this last question here, right? Do groups create and maintain structural inequality or inequity? Just because of the way they help support our identities. And what I hope you all do, this is a warning that does come out of early psychology, right? That we have to guard ourselves against being cognitive misers, right? Against being mentally lazy. So that when I see something that might not fit consistently with what I may believe, I shouldn't just dismiss it, right? If I am taking an economics course and I happen to be reading one theory and I'm enjoying it very much, I should go read the opposing theory, right? I should go find another point of view. Now, as I prepare to transition here, let me return to this sorting task, right? This task of sorting these 4 items was actually done in Russia by Luria in 1976, I believe. And what he did was he wanted to ask people to identify the odd object out. And what he found is that if he went into the Netherlands of Russia, right, away from the cities, away from where there is an urban development, urban populations, and he asked this question, what would they say? They would say, none. They're grouped together because they need each other. In other words, based on their world, based on their group and their culture, what was around them, they categorize the world differently. Categorize the world differently. In the United States, of course, right? If you think about the mind in America, do we do that? Right? If you think about the mind in America, do we group people? And do we do so at a higher rate than in some other countries? Let's take this last image for my slideshow to think about for a second. When many folks look at that, they don't see a president, a billionaire, or rock and roll Hall of Fame members. They unfortunately very quickly identify race.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of our great faults. And in order to really make that transition and better understand it, I'm going to turn to my dear friend and colleague who can help us understand this. Professor Kamei is going to take over now and talk about exploring the roots of racism and discrimination from a sociological perspective.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. Is my mic on? Yeah, it is. Okay. Cool. I want to, again, echo Michael Dulay's sentiments. I want to thank everyone who was involved in bringing this event, this extremely important event, together, and all the people that are in the audience. I glanced at it. It looks like there's 157 people here, including the speakers. And so thank you for being here. I know there are many things that you could be at, so we appreciate it. So the next thing then is we're going to explore the roots of racism and discrimination from a sociological perspective. To do this, we want to first begin with the basic concept of race. And you saw Professor Dulay talk about race. So in sociology, I often tell my students, race is a socio-historical concept, meaning race depends on the time and the place. It's got a nice rhyme that people could remember, but it's gone through many different iterations throughout our history. Different people have been placed into different categories, even in the United States. And I wish we had a lot more time, so I'll be brief here. We've gone through various court cases that have determined who falls into what particular race. One of the most important in order to be provided with certain powers, rights, and privileges in the United States is the so-called white race, especially after the 1798 naturalization law. And so in the early 1900s, there are some really important cases. One was in 1909. It was called the Halajian case. And so when Armenian Americans were in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, they were categorized as Asiatics, and therefore they're denied many of the rights that were provided to white Americans. And so Halajian and his legal team fought and won. To make this long story short, others also wanted to jump on the bandwagon, right? And say, hey, in 1922, Ozawa came up. And there was an Ozawa case where he said, hey, I'm American, I speak English, I'm assimilated, and in fact, my skin is even lighter than many of you so-called white folks who are Spanish or Italian. And then the courts, the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, you may be white, light skinned, but you're not Caucasian. And so in 1923, there was the Bhagat Singh case, excuse me, and he argues he is Caucasian, and therefore he should be provided with the right to be considered white. And in this case, the court, the same Supreme Court, flips it and says, no, white is what the common man says white is, and now it's no longer scientific. The reason why I bring this up is race is a social construct. It's really important to keep that in mind. It's based on our, physical appearances, what is real or perceived, and that's important because there could be people that are, like I said with Ozawa, lighter skinned than the white, but be categorized in a different category as a person of color. And so when we're looking at it as a social construct, we begin to look at the science, right? So thanks to the Human Genome Project back in the early 2000s, we discovered that human beings are all 99.9% alike. And so the very slight differences, like for example, eye shape, maybe hair color, hair texture, skin color, etc., are basically minor adaptations to environmental conditions. So now that we're pretty clear, and you should question it, that's absolutely fine. Read the research, right? That's what we ask you to do. Don't take it from me. Do your own homework. But if we are agreeing that there is no biological basis to race, then what is the function of race, right? What is the sociological significance? And there we argued that it is used to, as you saw in the earlier slides, to reproduce power and inequality. And so, can you go to, this is the slide, we can leave it there. So in fact, this made up notion, right? The specious concept, this concept that appears to be genuine, but it is not, has had devastating consequences for Black Americans for over 400 years. And so for me as a sociologist, I want to systematically understand what is going on, right? By examining the history as well as the current conditions. And so sociology has many tools. In a 45-minute session, there's no way that I could really explore these perspectives, but I will do my best to at least touch upon the three big ones in brief though, right? So one that I'm gonna start off with is the conflict theory. And so this theory has many different ways of understanding racism, but it's always about power and it's always about conflict. And one perspective under conflict theory looks at race within the context of capitalist class oppression. And this is really important. So from this perspective, it is argued that under capitalism, there are certain fundamental contradictions that exist. And the first contradiction would be between capital and labor. So to kind of simplify it, in order to maximize profits and outcompete your competitors, we often exploit labor, and race is often used as a tool to exploit labor. And so from its inception, can you go to the next slide? Race and racism has been used to justify many atrocities, right? Here you see the stealing of Native American land and all the applications of race in order to justify it. Even the enslavement and the genocide of Native Americans were justified under this specious, right? Not genuine, but appearing to be genuine in people's minds concept. And unfortunately, this became a convenient way of maximizing profits while morally justifying the atrocities. So we want to keep this in mind because it doesn't just disappear hundreds of years ago. There is a common theme that I want to come back to. Now, from the other sociological perspective, it's called structural functionalist perspective. They would argue that if something exists, it must serve some type of function. And so from the functionalist perspective, a function that race might serve is to morally justify, right, these atrocities, to maintain inequality by arguing that it helped to maybe move our economy forward. It made us who we are as a nation. But to be fair, the structural functionalists also recognized that there are dysfunctions or negative consequences of racism as well. And so on the next slide, I want to talk about the arrival of Africans, right? In 1619, just last year, we were talking about it's been 400 years, right? And so there's debate with regards to the exact status of the first Africans. Were they indentured servants? Were they free? But by the late 1600s, according to anthropologist Audrey Smedley, it becomes very clear, right? Their status becomes very clear. And the reason for this, it is argued, is that in 1676, there was a major rebellion. Now, the historians will be exploring these in greater detail. I'm just touching upon them to provide a sociological analysis. But there was a rebellion that occurred. The reason why this rebellion is important is that poor Black folks and white folks who far outnumbered the elite, right, within society, got together to rebel. They rebelled against Governor William Berkeley. And I would imagine that it scared the living daylights, I'll put it that way, because it's being recorded, out of him and the elite, right? But there is a uglier side to the rebellion. Dozens of Native Americans were killed. I guess that would be for another presentation. But from a conflict perspective, when things like this occur, when rebellions occur, right, they occur because of the inequality that exists within society. So the exploitation of the workers, many of the individuals, even the white working class, were folks that were recently indentured servants that received their freedom, right? They did their service and they wanted a piece of the pie. And so when the elite sees something like this, they are going to respond. And so, of course, in order to maintain social control in sociology, and I'm sure in other disciplines, we argue that the two ways are through consent, which is ideal, right, for the elite, or also coercion through force. And so in this particular instance, Audrey Smedley argues that the elite established a system. They basically institutionalized slavery. So there's racial slavery that occurred. So in effect, through institutionalizing slavery, it divided and separated, right, and conquered the working class. Can we go to the next slide? And so in this way, right, the strategy created, well, you already see divide and conquer the workers. This was highly profitable as well, unfortunately. And so how do we justify such an inhumane system, right? Because obviously at one point we have a situation where folks are getting together. The history shows, right? Historical records, anthropological records show that white and Black often commingled. So this sudden change, right, is drastic, is dramatic. So how do we justify the inhumane system of slavery? And so one of the methods is ideological racism, right? In this way, people try to rationalize the system. And so they began to directly link physical characteristics to intellectual, and psychological characteristics. So to be quick here, it relates a lot to what Professor Dulay was talking about. Like, where do we get these ideas, right? How do we place certain ideas into our schema that we use to understand the world? And so ideological racism, to simplify it, people with lighter skin were provided with more positive definitions, like more industrious, more intelligent, and honest. Those with darker skin were provided with more negative definitions, such as less honest, less industrious, or maybe lazy, right? And even ideas like criminality start to develop. And so this is ideological racism. And this system, unfortunately, going to the next slide, divided, right, the individuals. So it created this artificial separation. And this is really important to reflect upon, and a notion of privilege. And this privilege was based solely on skin color, right? And that's why it became so important, even in the turn of the 20th century, for people to try to go to court to fight to be considered white. And so that's a concept to keep in mind, this notion of privilege, because if there is privilege based upon skin color, then there must be those that are disadvantaged by skin color as well. And so this, as you can see up here, made it difficult to challenge the economic, political, and social arrangements, and made rebellion more difficult with time. A lot of what I'm gonna say is related to Professor Dulay's talk. So when we're discussing narratives, really we're talking about stories. In sociology, we often use the word social constructs, right? And so these narratives are extremely important to understand. In fact, we wouldn't be able to succeed as human beings if it wasn't for being able to have a common story that can bond us, that we can operate under, right? And so these stories, though, have to be carefully examined. So when these stories involve problems like race, the way it's defined, ideological racism, institutionalized slavery, right? They become established in our culture, and people begin to treat them as if they are real, whether they're doing this consciously, and this is really important, or subconsciously. And so through socialization, right, it's this process by which we learn the ways of society. These stories, these narratives get passed down generation to generation. Like when Professor Dulay was asking, like, when do we learn these ideas, right? We existed before our memory. We learn it from that point and on from afterwards, right? And so the crazy thing about it is that once we start to establish it, things happen rather quickly. So these ideas quickly become what sociologist Emil Durkheim called social facts. And so social facts are these things that exist outside of us, right? Like our institutions, it might be our norms, it might be values, statuses, and roles that basically exert tremendous influence over our behavior and our thoughts. And so what appears to be natural, if you go back far enough, it was human made. It was a social construct, but we began to treat it as if it is real, as if it has always been here. And this situation, unfortunately, could cause good people, right? And I know some people might question my use of the word good here. So that is absolutely fine. I always ask my students, question everything, right? It's an important starting point. But it may cause good people to perpetuate a lifestyle that is inhumane. So before the 13th Amendment, as an example, you could have a loving father and husband who cared deeply about his family, his community. In those days, maybe they use language like God-fearing individual. He may still be absolutely fine with ownership of another human being, right? And so that's because of these narratives and the social facts. And so ideological racism allowed for the justification and continuation of the process of dehumanization. That was a nice rhyme there. That took place, right? So as this was occurring, human beings, right, were turned into property. Black Americans were bought, they were sold, tortured, raped, and later on lynched, right, for hundreds of years. And as you can see from this image, the racism was so ingrained in our society that entire families even came out to watch and participate in lynchings. And I just wanted to read something from the Raleigh News and Observer from 1930, right? It was in their editorial. And this was published in and quoted in the Guardian newspaper. Quote, whole families came together, mothers and fathers bringing even their youngest children. It was a show of the countryside, a very popular show. Men joked loudly at the sight of the bleeding body. Girls giggled as the flies fed on the blood that dripped from the Negro's nose, end quote. So it gives you a description of how things were. And these public spectacle lynchings, that's what they were, often involved selling of tickets. And so people, right, families even, were buying tickets to watch such a grotesque display, right, of human atrocities that were taking place in our history. And so I'm gonna go to the next thing though. Now we're talking about narratives and ideological racism and how people begin to accept certain things without question and social facts. But this moral justification is never 100%. It isn't, right? And so since it can't be 100% complete, and we understand that it's often the case with human beings that we're often faced with contradictions, then people were asking themselves, right? How can we be good, a good human being, while allowing such an inhumane behavior or system to continue? And so from this point, during this period, collective guilt and fear begins to develop. I know that's more of a psychological perspective projection, so forgive me for applying here, but it's a very important one because we're talking about it in a collective manner. And so as an example of this projection, right, and the criminalization of Black Americans, one example would be this notion of the Black man raping the white woman, right? It's a fear that's been used throughout the years. But anyone that looks at the historical record or has any understanding of power relationships understand that it was much more likely, right? And it was the case, unfortunately, that there are many cases of white men raping Black women and Black girls. So despite this reality, can we go to the next slide? Despite this reality of Black Americans being victims of human rights violations, the South had slave patrols. So I'm kind of moving it in a slightly different direction. And these slave patrols were applied against the victims of human rights violation, right? The Black Americans, to basically maintain the social order of that particular period. Excuse me. So this criminalization, we're gonna see now in the next slide, begins to take on a whole new meaning by the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment, excuse me. So you can see here in the 13th Amendment, Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, which is beautiful, right? Want to end it, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the US or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so I want people to understand that by examining this through the theoretical framework of conflict theory, the passage of the 13th Amendment in effect, right, re-enslaved some Black Americans through convictions related to vagrancy and loitering laws. So this process ensured, and again, going back to this contradiction between capital and labor, it ensured, right, the exploitation of these individuals who were convicted. They were now put on chain gangs to clear the lands that the slaves in the past cleared. And of course, it disenfranchised and disempowered those who were convicted, because there are all sorts of laws that prevented individuals who had felonies from voting. Those come a little bit later, but it's systemic. And that's the point that I want to make very clear. Professor Dulay used the word institutionalized racism. This is embedded into law. This is where the economic and the political are coming together, right? Under these laws, so-called laws, I really want to say, but they're laws, Black codes. You had laws like vagrancy laws, and then you see the convict lease programs that also begin to develop. And I want to read a quick quote by a political economist named Karl Marx on this subject. And it's a quote: violations of the law are generally the offspring of economic agencies beyond the control of the legislator, but it depends to some degree on the official society to stamp certain violations of its rules as crimes or transgressions only. This difference in nomenclature, so far from being indifferent, like this naming of it, decides on the fate of thousands of men. And it absolutely, right, impacted thousands of young Black men. Many of them weren't even adults. So we have to keep that in mind. And kind of connecting it with recently, a legal scholar by the name of Michelle Alexander writes about the disempowerment and disenfranchisement of Black Americans under the war on drugs in her book, The New Jim Crow, right? Mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness, I think was the subtitle. But check it out if you have time. So to justify the mass incarceration, connecting it with the narrative, connecting it with the ideological racism, right? The stereotypes. Check this out. One argument that was given for the vagrancy laws was to stop crime before it happened. So again, it's this notion of Black criminality, right? If people are vagrant after the so-called freedom was provided, difficulties finding work, well, they're likely to commit crimes, more likely than other racial groups, right? And so this is an important concept. Today, we won't have a chance to talk about it, but there is the criminalization of the homeless that people are talking about it as well that needs to be addressed. Can we go to the next slide? And so now I'm gonna quickly, I know there's a lot we're covering and I'm watching the time. The post, let's see, Reconstruction era, right? So after the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, we're talking about into the 1900s, into our, well, maybe not all of yours, my century, the century I was born into, where I lived most of my life, right? Even as a young adult. But I'm not old yet either, as Professor Dulay pointed out, we're still young. So a method of social control, right? Going back to the notion of the elite trying to maintain control, it's always through consent is there, right? Through ideology, the set of beliefs that guide society, but there's also force. And the two often go hand in hand. And so social control here was applied through lynching to maintain the economic and power structure, political structure of society. So people that I would recommend you reading if you have time, Ida B. Wells Barnett, especially, right, writing in this period. She wrote A Red Record and she also wrote Southern Horrors. Southern Horrors, I'm gonna give you something from Southern Horrors, that particular publication. So in it, she talks about how lynching was basically justified through claims, right? That someone had raped a white woman or attempted to rape, etc. But she makes the argument based on her careful research that it was primarily done to undermine Black economic progress. And so this is where it falls under, again, the theoretical framework of conflict theory in sociology, right? And also what's really disgusting, and it's an aside, is from 1968, oh, excuse me, that's the year I was born. From 1882 to 1968, there are 4,742 confirmed lynchings that occurred in the United States, right? Confirmed, it's important. And so one example, and I'm gonna be very quick on this one, is the Mary Turner lynching, just to show the brutality, because this one is even more brutal. So please, I want to warn folks, this is very graphic, right? And it can be disturbing in case any kids are out there, because I can't see where people are, who's out there. Okay, I'll read it. Well, basically, I won't read it. I just give you the quick summary. So on May 16, 1918, a plantation owner was killed, allegedly by a Black man. And so in response, several, I think 13 Black Americans were killed. One of them was a person by the name of Hayes, Mary's husband, back in May 18, 1918. So Mary had the audacity, right, in their eyes, in the eyes of the elite, to complain and to protest. In order to maintain social control, they made an example out of her. So the next day they get Mary and they hang her upside down. They douse her with gasoline, burn her to death. Now she was 8 months pregnant at the time. They cut out her baby, right? Because she's 8 months, viable. And one of the men crushed the baby's skull with his heel. I know it's very graphic, I apologize. And then as she was hanging, they sent, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but like 100 bullets through her. And so the reason why I bring this up is how brutal, right, these messages were and how much of an effect it has on individuals. Not only African Americans, Black Americans that are fighting for their freedoms, but are those that might want to become allies as well. Can we go to the next slide? The other thing that I wanted to point out is the relationship between, like we saw the slave patrol, but also the long history of police violence towards communities of color, especially Black communities. We often want to talk about the history, and it's really good that we are discussing the present because it hasn't gone away, right? I'm a little over 50 years old, so I've experienced certain riots in my lifetime as well. And as a kid, I recall my dad talking about the 1965 Watts riot when he was working in Crenshaw and we were living in Boyle Heights. And I remember the 1992 LA rebellion, some called it the LA riots, and others, right, in other cities, etc. And here we have mass protests. Much of it, right, is related to this long history. In fact, oftentimes, and this is from the conflict perspective, the police have, whether they're consciously doing this or subconsciously doing it, have served the interests of the propertied and property. And I don't have time to discuss the many labor struggles that have existed in our country and the bloody nature of those struggles and how the police or National Guard or State Guard were called in and in some cases violently killed, right, protesters, and in some cases families. In one case, the Ludlow massacre involved white miners, but we don't have time for that. But I just wanted to point out there is this history. And this is one of the reasons why the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was formed, right? It was in response to the violence. And in fact, they created a system where they would watch the police to try to minimize violence against the public, against their neighborhood. And it was working pretty effectively too. But of course, maybe it was too effective. Because when you read this particular historical period, the Black Panther Party did some really amazing things. And again, this would take too long for this lecture. But one of the most interesting is that they reached out as the FBI, right, had noted. One threatening aspect of the Black Panther Party was they didn't have the hate whitey, quote unquote, message. They were reaching out to all groups, all racial groups, including white folks, like the Young Patriots, right, like Appalachia. And there was a famous person by the name of Fred Hampton. Read up on him. He's the one that created the Rainbow Coalition. And he brought together people of different ethnicities. Unfortunately, he was killed by the Chicago police in his sleep. And maybe on another day, we'll talk more about that. But in order to respond to the movements, there has to be two pronged approaches. One is to try to undermine them, call them a bunch of thugs, radicals that don't know what the hell they're talking about. They're unpatriotic, etc. But the other, unfortunately, is through the use of violence, whether it's through literal violence, like in the killing of Fred Hampton, or imprisonment of leaders. And so can we go to the next slide? And so on this next slide, whoops, never mind. Can we go back to the former slide? I think I might have taken it out. That's funny. We see, right, this approach that is taking place. Let me gather my thoughts real quickly. May have gotten way ahead of myself, and then I'll just bounce if I have to bring it back here. Oh, yes, I did want to mention this. Definitely want to mention this. And so from the sociological perspectives, it's really important. We don't all agree, right, when it comes to examining social phenomena. We don't have the same understanding, and that's important. Right? We should have open dialogue, like Professor Dulay said. We need to be open-minded. We have to be aware of our own assumptions and presuppositions, challenge them, fully listen to, right, these opposing views, consider them. So with the sociological perspectives that I wanted to just quickly mention, structural functionalism, again, they would look at the police as extremely critical in maintaining social order. In fact, they would see them as maintaining balance and harmony within society. Whereas the conflict theory, right, those that approach it from the conflict theory are much more likely to view the police as agents of social control that protect the interests of the well-to-do, help to knock out any kind of rebellion, and they, in effect, serve the interests of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. So these are two very different views. And as I tell my students, don't jump onto a particular perspective. Try to understand all sides, because right now, as we're talking about the movements that are occurring, right, with the Black Lives Movement, the movement to defund police, there are obviously many people within these movements that have different perspectives. It would be really cool for them to examine these under the theoretical framework so they could have a more complete discussion, but that's again for another day. But for the sociological perspective of symbolic interactionism, this theory is really cool too. It helps us to understand where we're coming from to a large extent. And as it says right there, oftentimes our understanding of the way the world works comes from our lived experiences. So maybe the functionalists are more likely to have had lives where the status quo, the way things are, has worked for them. And that's great, right, for them. But from the conflict perspective, like the Black Panther Party, like some of the members that you see here, like Huey P. Newton, right, Bobby Seale, for them, they were trying to end their disadvantaged position. And so others that were maybe even advantaged, that were conflict theorists, were still fighting for those disadvantaged positions to change. Now, everything, unfortunately, will always be about struggle. And I talk about this all the time. In sociology, I'm sure they talk about it in other disciplines, especially like political science. And so the struggle for power must be examined. So today I'm going to go kind of quick for the sake of time, so we'll leave some time at the end for questions. So the next slide talks about this struggle. I think it does. Yeah, the struggle for power. The sociologists are very aware, right, of and understood power. For example, Max Weber understood, right, that the legitimacy of authority rested on the people's acceptance, right, of that particular authority as legitimate. And as history has shown us, it can get rather precarious. Not just major revolutions that we've seen in the world, including our own, right, in the 1700s, but even throughout our history, power has been challenged. And so as the Black Power movement, along with other movements, there are many other movements that were occurring at this time in the 1960s, there was an effort to shut it down. It's almost 6:30. And so I'm gonna go directly to this. One of the efforts was to criminalize Black Americans and criminalize those that are involved in the movement. Historians will tell you about the Red Scare in the early part of the 20th century, the communist witch hunts, right, after World War II. But here I want to mention focusing in on the criminalization of Black Americans. And so the counterintelligence program led by the FBI leader, J. Edgar Hoover, whom you see here, they played a major role in the criminalization of African Americans. And fortunately, through some Senate hearings, declassified information, even the testimonies of former FBI, a lot of this came to light. So we could speak about this much more freely than at one time when people would have questioned these. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see something very disturbing. This is from an interview with Harper's Magazine. John Ehrlichman, as you can see up here on your slide, was a key advisor to President Richard Nixon. And he was quoted as saying, right, you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, right? Ehrlichman said. And we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Do we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this is based on an article in Harper's Magazine with an interview with John Ehrlichman. Unfortunately, what we see, though, with the start of the war on drugs under Nixon in the 1970s, going on for decades, right, afterwards, there was a disproportionate number of African Americans that were impacted by this war on drugs. And so that would be the next slide. In fact, studies have shown that African Americans, Black Americans, make up roughly 13% of all drug users, but over 50% of those incarcerated for drugs. And when you look at some states, it's the disproportionate nature of it is worse. And so the war on drugs and laws like 3 strikes had a disproportionate impact. And the sad thing about this is that it becomes a vicious cycle as people see more Black Americans in prison. It begins to reinforce the notion of Black criminality in the minds of the public. Let's go to the next slide. So I'll do this kind of quick. moving quickly into the 1970s and 1980s. This period is also very important for sociologists to study because there was a devastating impact that occurred in our cities, especially the so-called inner cities, due to globalization and deindustrialization. So there was outsourcing of jobs, the moving of factories to other countries. And this fits really well with the notion of, again, this contradiction between capital and labor. So this is occurring because of competition, the desire to maintain profits, to increase profits, and this led to the marginalization of the working class, especially Black Americans. And so again, we understand from the theories, kind of going quicker now, that when you have a large surplus labor, right, lots of unemployed people, there's going to be agitation. There's going to be movements towards rebellion. And in fact, there probably will be rebellion. And on top of that, we had the real stress and struggle of a stagnating real economy. So this required different places to invest surplus value. One place that we won't talk about today is through the process of financialization. But the other partial solution was the prison industrial complex. And so on the next slide, maybe it's the next, no, it's not on the next slide. Never mind, let's stay on this one real quick. With the prison industrial complex, we want to understand what kind of impact that it had and why it developed. So in a nutshell, I'll just recommend a couple things. There's a wonderful book and a very well-researched book by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's actually a geographer, and she wrote the book Golden Gulag, and she lays out the social, political, and economic factors that led to the increased number of prisons being built in California in the last quarter of the 20th century with its concomitant increase in the prison population. In fact, she does an excellent job talking about the political economy of prisons. And she explains that it was a response to the real economic crisis that California faced because of the surpluses that we had in things like financial capital, land, labor, and even state capacity. But long story short, this along with really draconian laws led to serious outcomes. More Black Americans are in prison. So on the next slide, we'll see that in the 80s and 90s, I remember this period really well. Prominent figures, right, within politics and outside of politics began talking about what do we do about the violence in the inner cities? And instead of providing a careful analysis, looking at the social, economic, and political conditions, right, that create and perpetuate violence, draconian laws, that I should have put that up there, and simplistic notions and labels were often applied. And unfortunately, media often, not always, I don't ever talk in absolutes. Right now, I'm speaking kind of fast because we're in a time crunch, but everything is much more complicated than it seems. But the media, to some extent, exacerbated the problem. And for the sake of time, let's just go through the quick, there's a slide here of two images, right? The first one is the Associated Press. A young man, it says, walks through chest-deep water after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. He appears to be Black American, right? On the bottom, American Free Press caption says, two residents, already the language is very different, wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. I just have to laugh. What's the difference, right? Of course. But there is a significant difference. Who are you more likely to shoot? A looter or a quote unquote finder? And I hope you would say neither. But of course we understand that we're more likely to shoot a looter. And it led to atrocities, like in the case of the Danziger Bridge massacre, where unarmed Black Americans seeking refuge, safety from the devastation of Hurricane Katrina were fired on, unarmed, were fired on by the New Orleans police. 2 were killed and 4 were injured. And so the 2 that were killed, I just wanted to, I want to name names, right? There's a 17-year-old, I'll try to find it, here it is, by the name of James Brissett, and a 40-year-old by the name of Ronald Madison. And so there's some real consequences. Can we go to the next slide though? So here, I want to talk about symbolic interactionism. I'll try to wrap it up in less than 10 minutes. I'll really do my best. So symbolic interactionism is a really interesting theory. It really emphasizes the socially constructed nature of reality. It talks about how we begin to understand society and the world through interaction with others. And this is important and it relates very much to what Professor Dulay said. A famous symbolic interactionist by the name of George Herbert Mead even argued that our human mind is a social product. Check this out. So you can't think without symbols, right? And symbols come from society through language. So without society, we would not possess what is referred to as a human mind. And in that regard, we are limited also by those symbols and the meanings that are attached to them and how we have processed them throughout the years. I'm gonna have to kind of cut this a little quicker though. So reflect on that, right? Reflect on it, it's important. Oh, can we go back real quick though, Mike? And so we learned the prejudice, really important. These labels begin to become established in our minds, and it makes it very difficult for us to see other people, right? Except through selective perception, through the prevailing stereotypes that we've been taught, unfortunately, even if we don't want to believe them. And it also makes it harder for people of different racial groups to understand each other's experiences and perspectives. So on this next slide, we won't go through all of it, but just look at it very quickly. This was recently published in the Washington Post. It was a study that was done by Pew. Very interesting, right? Depending on the race of the respondent, very different outcomes. 7 in 10 white people thought police usually gave the right amount of force. 1 in 3, 33%, Black folks did. And then when you're looking at police officers in 2017, high-profile police killings were isolated incidents or part of a more systemic problem. More than 70% of white officers said it was, whereas nearly 60% of Black officers said that they were signs of a broader problem. So going back to that notion, right, of lived experiences or life experiences. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. And so these can have very traumatic outcomes. In social, we often say that we could be living in the same country, but living in different social realities, because we may understand the world differently based on our life experiences, and people may view us very differently based on their lived experiences. And so this one here, I wanted to emphasize the notion of threat, and man, it really ties neatly with Professor Dulay and the research that he cited, Dulay's talk and the research that he cited. So when you're looking at this threat, right, again, to be fair, we have to examine each situation separately, right? But for the sake of time, I'm going to argue that in this particular case, Amadou Diallo only had a wallet in his hand, but 41 shots were fired at him and 19 struck him and killed him, right? And so social scientists want to understand. And so since Professor Dulay already laid out a lot of the good research, I'll be very quick on one that I found very interesting. And it's the studies on perceived threat using video games. So they want to see what is the likelihood that the subject is going to shoot an armed or an unarmed Black target or a white target in a video game. And through these studies, the findings are the subjects, regardless of their race, are much more likely to shoot a Black target, quote unquote, but not shoot a Black target, and shoot an unarmed Black target, but not shoot an not shoot an armed target, right? More likely is the point. When the studies are done on the police were much more accurate, but unfortunately, even in those studies, they oftentimes were impacted by certain implicit biases that they carried. And the concern, if you're interested, nah, I better not. So the point I wanted to make, and we'll cite some of these sources for you. I think that would be the place to go. In a high stress situation, because being an officer is not easy, right? That implicit bias can make the huge difference between life and death. So on the next slide, just very quickly, I just wanted to point out how the sense of threat, the perception of threat has been well understood in Black communities. Moms and dads for generations have talked to their kids, especially sons, about this threat and how to behave. And it fits really well with another sociological perspective by W.E.B. Du Bois, a concept, called double consciousness. And Professor West succinctly summarized it as looking at oneself through the distorted and stereotyped lens of others. And so you could be a stand-up individual, but you must also understand how society may be viewing you in certain encounters. And so behavior often must be modified to protect oneself. So on the next slide, I'm skipping a little bit, but in that slide, I just wanted to point out, it is obviously dangerous. And so it's not an easy situation. I do understand that being a police officer comes with many risks and dangers, but being Black in America, unfortunately, based on research, makes it clear that there are risks as well. And so when we look at studies, oftentimes people might say something like, yeah, but aren't more white Americans killed by the police than Black Americans? And this is true. So what you have to understand is proportionality, right? There are far more white Americans, if you're looking at numbers, than Black Americans. And so if you look at this as evidence from 2015, and there are other sources too, unarmed Black men were 7 times more likely to be killed than police, than their unarmed white man, than an unarmed white man. And so it's very disproportionate. That's the key. And so the next slide I want to talk about, and try to wrap it up soon, is in social, we look at different levels of discrimination. And so the individual level of discrimination, we want to look at each case separately. Indeed, there are some really good cops that are out there that want to make a difference in their community, and they risk their lives every day, right? And that has to be considered. You also have cops that have racist ideas and bad intentions. But another thing that we have to consider is the cultural biases that exist within individuals, whether they know it or not. That's important. And so if we're honest with ourselves as Americans, we know that there have been many problems, right? As individuals, there have been Black Americans, the police were called on them for doing innocent things like selling water, hanging out at Starbucks, sleeping, in a common room by the dorm. And in some cases, the police were even called on Black Americans to try to threaten them. So this problem does exist within our society. Now, the question is, how deep is it within individuals that are here to protect and to serve? So when we go to organizational discrimination, you can see, right, we want to examine the culture of the organization. And so in some cases, it's very blatant and obvious. FBI has been warning us since 2006 that there are white supremacists infiltrating the police. In some cases, like this neo-Nazi police chief or police chief that was had ties to neo-Nazis, he was fired, or he resigned, excuse me, but he got a job somewhere else. But in many cases, it's much more subtle. And so on the next screen, we want to kind of look at some of the more subtle ways. And so the first one is, do the police departments, right? And they're not all the same. That's very important to keep in mind. But do they have a theory of the office? Are they working on certain assumptions? Like, are they assuming that Black Americans are more likely to be involved in drug crimes than white Americans? And if we had time, I was going to cite some sources on research that has been done on this. But we are very careful in sociology. Anytime we see disproportionality, we don't immediately say that it is racial bias or racial profiling. We want to understand, though, is there diagnostic stereotypes, right? These assumptions being used. The warrior culture, this notion of us versus them, has to be addressed. Now, I understand in these dangerous conditions, especially male-dominated professions, there could be these us versus them scenarios that develop. Some of the worst cases are when cliques and gangs are formed, like the Vikings of the LA County sheriffs, right? Somebody sent me something private, I'll leave that. And the police unions too, though. I am a proud member of the AFT Local 2276. I'm a former president of our local union. I deeply believe in everything that unions do. But in the case of police unions, sometimes they're trying to protect the interests of their members. And I totally get that part. It's their job. But it can get in the way, right, of reform. And so we have to all step back, right, and try to have these open and honest discussions so that we can move forward. Last but not least, yikes, institutionalized, sorry, Mike, discrimination.
All right.
This is where it's institutional, like Professor Dulay was saying. We have to look at the laws, right? We have to look at the various portions of the criminal justice system. Why is there a lack of accountability? Why does it take protests to bring people to even court, right? To bring charges against them. And then afterwards, what happens? And so you all know that there is Justice and Policing Act that's went through the House of Representatives. This is where we're talking about, what do we do institutionally, right? If we had more time, I would have liked to have talked about the school to prison pipeline that disproportionately impacts Black students and Latinx students. But this discrimination obviously is much bigger than just what's happening in law enforcement. It cuts across all areas, right? As you can see here, and it has this synergistic impact. And so the next slide, I wanted to talk about COVID-19, but just wanted to say the violence is complex. It goes beyond what is often considered to be violent. And so the disproportionate number of African Americans dying because of systemic inequalities due to racial disparities in education, healthcare, economics is real, right? And we have to examine it if we want to have a, this kind of society that we hope we can have. So going on to the next one, I'm gonna make it 6:45. I'll make it. This is a quote by Martin Luther King. We often hear the one version of Martin Luther King, and that's absolutely cool. But I also wanted to provide this one. So he says, we must recognize that we can't solve a problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order. So what I was asking, I want to ask you all is, what does this look like now in the 21st century that we find ourselves in? I know this question is huge, and I want time for questions for Professor Dulay and myself, so I'm going to stop it there. I apologize if I went over. So thank you for your attention, and I'd love to hear your questions.
Thank you. Rich, while you're hot on the topic, we did get a question about the, there's a question if you could talk briefly about what it means to defund the police. Somebody's asked.
That's a really good question. I'm glad you asked. And so even within the movement, some of you that are out there are probably within this movement that is occurring, right? And there are different factions of the movement. So anytime there is a movement that occurs, there are different ways that people define it. And to make a long story short, and this is hard, there are different ideas right now from people, the various activists. Some want to see the absolute defunding and end, right, to the way that we police in our country. And you're seeing struggles, for example, in Seattle. I think the city hall was taken over, if I remember correctly. Camden, New Jersey did some pretty significant reform to their police department, right? Where they felt they had to start from scratch. So to make this long response shorter, it depends on people's perspective. Even under conflict theory, you'll have those that totally view the police as completely delegitimate, right? I mean, completely illegitimate. And so they would argue that we would have to end policing as it is, and the community should get together to create this new culture to police themselves, new institutions to replace it. But really, most people, I think, within this movement, I shouldn't speak for the movement, but I think a lot of people within the movement are probably talking about ways to move money from the police, right, to different areas. And so one area, one concern that many people have had is the militarization of the police, right? The funding of weapons, like Professor Dulay and I remember the song Batarang back in the day. We had basically military grade equipment that was used in our communities. And some people say we should use that money, defund to some extent, the money for areas like healthcare, improve education, improve local communities. And then that way you won't have to have the kind of police force that we currently see within our communities, and the relationships naturally could change to a mutually beneficial and respectful relationship. Right now, because of the time, I'm making it sound so much more unicorns and rainbows. The struggle to get there is extremely difficult. And again, to reiterate, not everyone sees that as defunding. There are those that really believe that we need to completely defund the police. And if you were to read theoretical perspectives that they are reading, the various literature, I think you would also understand why they have this particular view. But the likelihood is we're going to go through this process of trying to adjust laws, make police more accountable, and to use the money in more equitable ways. Because keep in mind, in California, as I mentioned, when we increased funding for the prisons, we're like #1 in the United States, right? We spend about $8.8 billion a year. I have to double check the number now. At the same time, our position in education has been dropping throughout the years. And so this is something that we have to question. Are we spending our money well? But I'm going to shut up and open up for more questions. And I can answer other people's questions later if you like.
I'm going to jump in and take one, Rich, and then we'll bounce back to another one. There's somebody's asking, why is it important for me to understand the side of someone who is clearly racist or ignorant? How will that help me?
That is it.
That's a very good question, especially in these times when even the most patient of us have the reaction to just be angry. And I'm not in the side that always is as forgiving as some people. But I do think that if I'm going to make social change and make broader, lasting change and not just be mad and isolate myself and create my own little world, I do have to understand the motivations of the person who has created the system that has kept me down, right? I have to understand at the very least why it is they're thinking the way they do in order for me to try to create change. In some ways, this is precisely what intelligence agencies do during times of war, when the United States, for instance, tries to understand a Nazi regime, right, during conflict. You know, that's to a certain degree, right? That's maybe a much more pragmatic approach. At another level, I do think that there is, consistently with both what Professor Kamei and I said, that people who learn how to behave in these terrible ways oftentimes don't even realize what they're doing. And when they do, and this is why I started with that cement analogy and the dust, right, and not being able to see it anymore, I think that's why that's so important, that people understand that, so that we can clear the air. When this is tied to a second question, right, that when this passes, when potentially a movement like this that's picking up so much steam, you know, can that level of energy sustain itself for months and years, is a social challenge. You know, and so you want to be able to have conversations and develop really clear understanding, because that's how I would argue that you create conversations, and that those conversations and those networks, that the groups that come out of that, that's how actually the change is sustained. It starts at the community, and it allows itself to kind of bounce around so that folks can take turns. And that's why, at least with the very first part of this series from our college, we're taking that first shot to try to step in and begin the conversations and start the change, knowing full well that there are over 700 faculty members at the college and hundreds of staff and thousands of students, that just within our local community, we may be able to have conversations and hopefully connect to the city and our local district, and that those changes will continue to spread, right? And a lot of that, so much of that is born out of understanding.
Absolutely.
Rich, there's a question here about the LA riots from Charles. During the 90s, the times of the LA riots, can you explain what caused some of the tensions between the Korean and Black communities?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I'm so glad that you brought that up. So when we have these particular riots, right, we have to understand the social and economic relationships that exist within the communities. So I'm going to take a step back, because a lot of people saw this as more of a Black versus Asian situation. In 1965, right, when the Watts riot occurred, many Japanese Americans lived in the Crenshaw district, and they grew up and worked with their African American, Black American neighbors, right, and classmates and co-workers. And so what's interesting is when that riot occurred, my dad actually got pulled over. They stopped his car, the rioters did. And when they saw that he was a Buddha head, right, as we call ourselves sometimes, Japanese American, they let him through. Specifically, he argued, based on that. Now, bringing it to 1992, the social relations began to change quite considerably. And so when you're looking at people, right, and resources, now the Korean Americans by the 1990s, they were owning businesses in the Black community. And so there was a unequal relationship that existed. Some argue that money was being taken out of the community, right, by these small business owners. I'm trying to remember the killing of the young Black woman, Latasha Harlins, the
yes.
year. What was the year of that? I'm trying to remember, and I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the year. I could look it up.
90?
If someone could look that up, that may have been a factor as well, but I thought that happened around that period. I just don't know if it was before or after. And that was by a Korean
91
American store owner, so it was. And so that also obviously exacerbates the problem. With that said though, I have to be very clear. This is the way the media showed it. And oftentimes you saw Korean store owners, now all the memories coming back to me with rifles and guns protecting their storefronts. But there are many instances, really important, where the Black and Asian community came together during the riots, where they protected some stores. And in fact, the healing of the community to some extent was based on the leadership of the Black and Korean churches. And so I don't want to make it seem like it was one group against the other, but to answer Charles's question kind of quickly, I think it had a lot to do with the differential economic relationships that existed. And now that we know the year of Latasha Harlins is killing, I'm sure that played a factor as well. I hope that answered it to some extent. And I could talk more maybe later after I reflect on it some more.
Yeah, the questions are starting to come in now.
Oh,
I
shoot.
just, you know, I received a question about what do we do, what can we try to do to overcome our biases? That's an important question. And I want to, you know, think back to what I said, right? The idea of somebody being a cognitive miser. I think that we fall prey to our biases when we become lazy and we let ourselves fall into patterns of thinking. That's really when we have snap judgments, when we meet somebody and we assume something about them, and then we make the mistake of treating them one way, right? When we're doing things where we might not even interact directly with that person, you know, maybe you're reading an email and you don't know anything about the person, you just see a name, right? If you're rushing through, if you're like me and you get 50 emails a day or, you know, whatever it might be, but maybe you just glance at the name and you look at it and you ignore it, right? That's an act of really unconscious preferential treatment or bias, right? I'm going to answer one because I assume something about it. And it takes a lot of work to acknowledge that is, in fact, a human weakness that I think we all have to be mindful and acknowledge that we may be biased when it comes to somebody's name, their gender, their ability level, right? We have to force ourselves to stop and think about that. And then I think the sister of that, right, the parallel process is you do have to make an effort to understand other people and other groups. That's of critical importance. And there are so many wonderful ways to do it, especially for the many of us that live in and around urban Los Angeles. It's completely unreasonable that you couldn't find the time to eat at a new restaurant or talk to a different person or listen to a different kind of music, or hell, flip the knob on the radio and listen to another news station. We have to commit to doing that. Part of being on a college campus is so wonderful because you have those opportunities seemingly down every turn, or nowadays down every Zoom password or Zoom logon. But we can see many other kinds of folks, and I think that's wonderfully important. There's a terrific question about examples of police departments that successfully overcoming the effect of implicit bias on police outcomes. Dan, that's one that I'm going to answer in much greater detail on Friday. I could give you a short answer, but that would not do it justice. I'll reach out to some of our other colleagues. I'm hoping that we could find somebody else to speak on the topic, and if not, I'll make sure that we have a thorough answer by next Friday, Dan. And then one more just popped in. Let's see if we can squeeze this one in. My question is to the professors: as Black Lives Matter movement and the defund police movement is picking up steam, what should we as not as Americans, but as a society as a whole, should we do to hear our voices and redress our grievances to the federal and state elected officials in Sacramento and Washington, D.C.? Oh boy. I would say, as I told my own family, that when we went out and we saw that there were quote unquote riots being reported on the news, I quickly said that's actually just democracy breathing. I think that the media will portray one or two awful incidents at a march or at a rally as being violent and frightening, when in fact, if you've ever been to a march, you know that if those things come up, they're a small percent of what happens. What is in fact happening is that you have the collective voice of a people standing up. And ideally that doesn't stop. I think that communicating with elected officials matters. I do think that Obviously, voting matters, but I think it's a mistake to think that's the only thing we should be paying attention to. I think we have to be mindful of which businesses we support. I think that we have to support efforts that promote dialogue, hopefully like this, where we can continue dialogue and include and involve as many people and parts of society as we can. And I want to transition to Professor Kamei, but I also want to make sure that I have the ability to wrap up at 7, because I know that our wonderful student government has set aside time for healing circles for the GCC students.
If you could be here next meeting, that would be great. Whoever asked that question too. And I think that's when we're going to be responding to a lot of the big questions, I believe.
Yeah, we'll have time tomorrow, obviously. And then on Friday, we'll jump back in and talk about, just as we were going to talk about policing and examples of change in police programs. We'll also revisit the broader idea, Gabby, of sustained change at the state, local, community, and federal level.
Wonderful.
Right. All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm looking at Kayla with hope. I'm wrapping it up a minute too late. I apologize.
No, it's okay.
I sincerely appreciate all your support.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much to our presenters, our moderators, our interpreters, our captioner. If you have any questions that weren't addressed tonight, I will be sending a link to an evaluation form where you can leave your questions or any additional feedback for tonight's lecture. And we'll be addressing those additional questions, as Professor Dulay and Professor Kamei mentioned, at our closing forum next Friday from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. And tomorrow's event will be covering the construction of American racism, and will be on this same link at the same time. If you want more information, that can be found on glendale.edu/anti-racism. And for GCC students, if you need a safe space to kind of just discuss and process all of these heavy topics that were just covered, we'll be hosting healing circles after each lecture, led by Dr. Troy Davis and our student equity counselors. And please join us on the separate link that I just sent in the chat. And yeah, thank you guys so much. I will have to end the Zoom. Let me stop the recording and just end the Zoom.
Thanks, Kayla.